What stood out for you that day? During that workshop, at the end of that workshop, what stood out the most for you?
I would say what stood out to me the most was their hunger to understand better what options were in front of them, regardless of where they were in their creative career or life journey. It was a real struggle I felt, to understand what was the territory that existed for them to know what choices they could make, whether it was to switch from, being a photographer to being another kind of creative professional, whether or not the conditions existed for their success moving on into the future, what it meant for them to move out of a position of poverty, frankly. I think we had a few people in the room that were very honest with us about they have struggled financially and they're not living the lives that they want to. What are the tools they need in order to get there? So I think I would encapsulate it as that. There was many who felt they really needed to find a source of information to understand what was the next right move for them.
Thank you. Hey, Mark, thank you so much for agreeing to join with me on this chat about creative profession. It's nice to see you.
It's great to see you too, Michelle. I'm glad that we can have this conversation.
Yeah, me too. So here's why I asked you here. We had a workshop at Word on the Street in Toronto where you invited me to come and join you. You were going to talk about your new book, The Starving Artist Myth, which talks about the myths and the issues and the lies and the taboos that are out there about the creative profession and how to bust those myths and set ourselves up for success as creative professionals. And the workshop was really successful because you had decided not to just talk about the book, talk about the numbers and the stats and what's happening in education, but also bringing me in to talk about some real life practical tools on how to set up a successful profession as a creative entrepreneur in Canada, at least.
That's right. The book covers a lot of things with respect to what I'm calling the starving artist myth, the background in where the stereotype comes from, getting a rooting in that, getting a rooting in how it influences things like education design and the way creators of all kinds tend to look at their chances of success, because it is not a popular notion that if you decide on a creative journey for your career, that you're going to be setting yourself up for prosperity and success. But in fact, we know that that is true from the experience of the graduates that we work with. But I really felt that in spite of the information that was in the book, what that workshop at Word on the Street really required was someone like you who works with creatives on coaching, on success practices, because ultimately this is a very personal journey for anyone who makes this decision. And it was just so great that you were there as a skills coach and as in the work that you do to actually work with the attendees we had in the room that day. And I think what we wanted to do was continue the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, with that in mind, why don't you tell me a little bit about where you started in the creative profession? What's your background and how did you get here?
My professional background is I went to university for theater initially, and I was always one of those kids in high school that had a real interest in acting. I was a pretty shy kid in high school. I was also first generation Canadian. My parents came to Canada in the late 60s from Scotland with two teenage kids in tow, and I came around a year later. And so as I was developing my interests in theater, I think like a lot of families, they probably thought, oh, this is a nice hobby for my teenage kid, but not necessarily something that we imagined that I would go into as a career. And so when I came home that day and declared that I was going to take theater in university, it was a pretty interesting moment. They didn't say much at the time, but it was very much a journey of acceptance and questioning and all of that. So my own professional work since then was I graduated from theater school, but I had an interest in producing. I had an interest in electronic media. So I published a magazine on the crossover between art and technology. And that led me to becoming a producer for the work of many different artists here in the Toronto area. And over time, that just evolved into producing animated films and documentary films, running my own small business, finding contracts where I could find them. And then I started teaching part-time in the early 2000s. And that led to the journey in education that I'm in now, where I work now as the Dean of the Faculty of Animation, Art and Design at Sheridan College, which of course is one of the top schools in the world for media, art, and design. So that's my background, but it absolutely encompasses a personal journey, like I know yours does as well.
Yeah. Well, how did that all coalesce into the book? Why the book?
The questions that led to the book were kicking around my mind for a long time. I think anyone who works at a college or university, whether it's as a teacher or an administrator, that in media art and design, you're constantly confronted by the same attitudes and questions. You're confronted by questions from parents and guidance counselors and high school students, just wanting to know if this is a good choice for them and expressing a lot of doubts, quite honestly, around what their chances are of success. And for me, there was always a dichotomy between the successes that I was seeing in graduates of these programs and what they went on to in their careers, not quite matching with the stereotypes that I kept hearing back from a lot of these very well-meaning people who just wanted to know. So the book really came about as a response to what was those questions for many, many years. The catalyst for it was the day that my own kid, during the pandemic, declared that they wanted to be an artist when they grew up. And and me kind of putting my head in my hands as a reaction in that moment, and in their presence went, "Oh no!" And of course, they quite rightly called me out on it and said, "Dad, you run an art school. You shouldn't say stuff like that." But in that moment, I was like any other parent. I had questions around, how could I make sure that they were successful? What were the challenges they were going to face? Like if I had an opportunity to actually say what all these years of experience lead to in terms of advice and guidance and so on, what would I say? And that essentially became the voice in my head that led to writing, that led to this thing that is now this book.
Mm. Oh, that's so wonderful. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about my own journey. So I grew up in Iran, and in high school, I was forced to major in math because I was too smart for art, which is literally the sentences that my middle school principal told my parents and freaked them out about my decision or my desire to go to art high school. And then when it came to university, I didn't tell my parents that I have switched and have applied for art schools instead until the day that the results came out in a massive newspaper. This is how it happened 30 years ago. Even then, I chose graphic design because I thought it would go down easier than fine arts. And so what you're saying, I really have lived. And my journey in a way since then, going to, graphic design in Iran, to advertising art direction at OCAD, working in advertising as an art director for about 5 years, and then having my own repping agency where I repped photographers for a few years, and then psychotherapy, and then coaching, has been this journey of how do you come back to that true calling, that inner true soul calling that says, do this, and not be thrown off axis from the types of pressures that you're talking about, which are systemic, familial, cultural, everything. So that's what I work with my clients to do, coming back to what it is they want to do. And then we find, how can we do that in the world as it is? Or how can we actually work to change that world? So what I love about talking to you is that you're kind of bringing in that second half that I don't have a lot of knowledge about. All of my knowledge about the world of the creative professional world is from my own experience and of course my clients. I've had clients who were actors, comedians, directors, writers, painters, dancers, but it's their point of view. What you brought in was a very realistic look at the creative profession. And I think that you complete the missing piece for me when I'm working with my clients with the knowledge, on the ground knowledge you have.
Well,
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. And it's true that the book tries to create some general principles that I think are true for everyone, regardless of their journey, and also provides hopefully some perspective in how to be resilient and how to adapt to change and how to understand that this very windy journey, like the journey that you've just described for yourself, that's not an exception to the rule. It doesn't mean that someone's a failure if it's not a linear path. It is the rule. The non-linear career life journey path is really encompassing all that it offers. But I'm curious because I love hearing stories like yours of people who have, you grew up in a certain environment, you followed a curiosity into graphic design, and now you're doing this incredible work, still seeing yourself as an artist, but moving those abilities and that sense that you have into working with people one-on-one, working with groups in the way that you do. How do you see that now? Like what was the decision point that made you think that psychotherapy and coaching was something that you wanted to do? And how do you leverage those skills that you developed as an artist or a visual thinker?
Well, I think that one of the reasons I wanted to be an artist, I actually wanted to do maybe cinema, was because I love human stories. So I get to hear, I remember when I was 8, I saw a movie, I think it was a Hollywood movie, I can't remember what it was, but there was a woman, a shrink, in an office, and the person came to them, and I thought, oh, I could just sit in an office and people come to me with their stories instead of me having to go and ask, because I was always very, very curious about human stories and telling human stories. So in a way, my creative heart, she's part of the whole service you get when you come to my office. And that's why I think psychotherapy is called an art, because my therapist taught me that it's an improvisational art. You have no idea what's going to come into the room and you have to play with it. So that's what I do. I use my art, but I also do little drawings. I just did a coloring book that is a self-reflective coloring book. My artist still finds a way in. And I love that because that's what I try to get my clients to tap into. Their little creative person inside, even if they're working at a bank, can live, because then it can guide them to even do their job at the bank more creatively. I'm a huge ally for that little rebel inside, the creative rebel inside that has been quieted down in many of us. And also the one that has had the courage to come out in the people that actually choose the creative professions. Because I actually think that takes guts. I mean, you said it yourself, like you as a creative professional gasped when your kid said, I want to be an artist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to hear you describe it that way. I was having a conversation with someone who is a business coach in California, who works with people that have established design firms. And, he brought up this question of, a lot of the people that he works with, because they started off as creatives and now they're business owners, they feel that they're not really exercising their creative abilities because they're busy managing a business, and they wish that they could get back to more of that visual work or whatever that medium was for them. It's interesting that they feel that way, because I actually think that dichotomy between creativity and business, especially being an entrepreneur, that separation, that being an entrepreneur is not in itself creative, is actually a false dichotomy. Being an entrepreneur
Absolutely.
is one of the most creative things you can do, because it is constant problem solving that you're having to engage in. So why do we place ourselves in these situations whereby we think that we're giving up on some part of ourselves creatively because we're engaged in business activity? I think a lot of that is because that's how we educate people. We have
They're
structured
separated.
education to separate it. Exactly. So when you're working with clients, how do you work with them in a way that helps to heal what is a perceived separation, but perhaps is not in actuality?
Just like you said, I get them to, first of all, find a way to connect with it. Oftentimes our creative is kind of in the shadows, especially if we've been told that's not okay, or it's been downplayed or dismissed, which was a lot in my family of origin and my culture. And first we try to find it. Who is it? What do they like? What would they do instead right now in this moment? How would they dress? How would they cook? We would find a way in, we would find a portal access to them. And then I would ask them together, we would come up with places where they can actually get that creative insight to come out more. And I would absolutely, like you're saying, I absolutely agree that entrepreneurship is a visionary job. It is absolutely, without creativity, it doesn't even exist. It would die. You then become a technical person, right? Or a manager. Even a manager needs to be creative. You need to know how to deal. You need to be able to, I think a creative person is a person who can see what's happening, but also not lose sight of their vision. And then make sure that they do whatever they can in there, even if it's using things that they're not supposed to in a way. I mean, of course, not illegally, but you know what I mean? Like being a bit mischievous. It's that energy we had when we were teenagers. When we wanted to do something, we made sure we got it done. And we made sure nobody knew that we got it done because we wanted to make sure we don't get into trouble. I think that creative energy is that energy. And if we can access it as adults in ways that are in service of where we want to go in life, then that's it. That's you being creative. And I think that's you being an artist, because that's 100%. What it is. Artistry is doing something that has a message, that has a purpose, and it's done in a way that is creative. It's slightly outlawed. It's not following the rules to the T. It's different. It's subversive. That's what creative energy is.
I think you're really picking up on something, because we have to, in my view, is that regardless of the medium or the discipline that any creative person is walking into, whether it's photography or painting or music or acting, or if you want to be an animator, you want to be a graphic designer, that inevitably you're going to learn certain rules of that field, but it doesn't end there. That's just the beginning. It's really then a question about not just what is it you want to create within that, but how do you actually break down those silos? How do you actually reinvent? How do you actually create new rules or break the rules? And that is as true for a business owner as it is for a person wanting to get a job in a film studio or an animation studio. But I think your work is such a good connecting point of how individually we can make relationships between the original impulses that we had to actually follow those creative curiosities into something where we could actually make a living out of it, but then also become a little bit more of that rebel as we go to say, no, I'm not going to play those rules. I'm not going to actually do everything that I'm told, because I have my own voice. I actually have different things to say, and I have different ways that I want to say it.
That's right.
And it's absolutely a requirement. I interviewed many artists and producers and designers for the book, and they all found that moment that they came to realize that there was something they had to do different or not play by the rules in order to get themselves to the next level. It was the one thing that they all had in common, regardless of their backgrounds and where they were coming from and all of that. So yeah, being a rebel is such an important thing if this is what you're choosing, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, then this brings me to the question then, in your experience in the creative education systems, what's missing? What is being taught, but what's being missed? What's being looked over?
Yeah, it's a huge question. And I do think that we're in a moment where, not just in Canada, but in many different places around the world, we are having to rethink our education approaches for this new economy, post-pandemic economy that we find ourselves in. Because let's just break it down for a second. So most of our formal education traditions in the Western world really come from Europe. European practices, historical European practices. And it's very important that we actually understand, in my view, what that has led to in terms of the relationship that has been built between an academic tradition in the service of artists and whether or not that was a recognition that you were connecting that education to an economy or if you were connecting it to outside the economy. And what I argue is that traditionally it has been disconnected from the economy. So it's very much created curriculum traditions that root the training of artists to be dependent upon patronage, dependent upon the state, dependent upon, in modern terms, public support or support from donors or private individuals or foundations or so on, because of the historical relationship between artists and class structures that existed in Europe. So fast forward today, what does that translate to? I think if you ask most people who came from media art or design programs, doesn't matter what school, I would say ask them, of the following 4 categories, what did your education give you? So let's go through the 4 categories. Number 1, your craft. That's something that I would argue that many schools are very, very good at. That's category 1. Category 2, the business conditions of your craft. Did you come out of your education experience with an understanding of, regardless of what field you were in, how did that relate to it being a business? And what did business success actually look like? Number 3 is the socioeconomic influences for the pursuit of your field as an artist or practitioner in your discipline of choice. What are the economic influences that change the conditions for success? What are the social movements that change the conditions for success? Did you come out of it with an understanding of those things? And then number 4, very practically, is what are your tools for success? What are your technology tools? What are your marketing tools? What are the strategies that you have available to you to ensure that you're constantly trying to find new opportunities, either in an employment market or an entrepreneurship market or self-employment? So those are the 4 categories. So Mashad, let me ask you, as a creative who went through an education system, in your experience, what of those 4 things would you say you got the most of?
I went to OCAD when it was an arts college before it became a university, so I can't really comment on what it looks like now. I graduated in 1999. It definitely helped with the craft, the way to think about advertising. Focus was really about concept. Our portfolios were relevant. The ideas we came up with were relevant. It wasn't just that, it was an art direction school, but we were really, really good graphic designers that did ads. And I don't think it helped us get ready for interviews. And I was a new immigrant at the time. I could have really, really used that. I had no idea how the interview process works in Canada. So in that way, I don't think it set us up for success. But in terms of conceptual creation side, I still benefit from what I learned at OCAD. I still think the way I was taught to think by Terry Isles, my teacher, or by Alan Casimir, those, veterans of advertising. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if you had to place one of those 4 things at the top, that craft would be number 1.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you got business too, to a certain extent.
Yes.
And then what I heard you say about, you could have used more help with portfolios and interviews. Those are tools for success. So maybe you could have benefited from that a little bit more. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And what about the larger picture with respect to socioeconomic influences? Did that come in? Right. So
No.
I think what you've just described is the way that many would describe their experience, because most schools are really good at craft. So to get back to your question, what needs to change in education? It's the other 3 things to actually amplify the way that education can actually support a well-rounded creative individual. And this can be a bit controversial for some because there can be a tenuous relationship between art practice and capitalism in our society. And so my point of view on this is, look, even if you're teaching someone business and you're teaching someone tools for success, they still have choices that they could exercise or not exercise to understand how any creative field operates within the economy and how that education that you should be getting is actually responding to how the economy actually influences your factors for success. Some want to step outside of having to think of themselves as, say, an entrepreneur, and they want to work as an independent artist that is as free from as many economic conditions as possible. And I say, no problem. You
Yeah,
absolutely got that choice.
choice.
I just want everyone to have the same availability of tools to them, regardless of what
Hmm.
style of education they're coming through.
Yeah, that's so important because, as you said, if you're missing those pieces and then you're basically the day you graduate, you're thrown into the market. You don't even know how you're supposed to make those choices or where you're supposed to go to gain access to those types of informations. But wouldn't it also then mean that the teachers teaching need to be relevant or need to have relevant information? Because that part of the legacy of education, especially in the arts, is that you could have been a successful artist or a creative professional 30 years ago and you're still teaching, which has incredible value in terms of the wisdom and the legacy. But if you're not upgrading your information about what's happening in the world right now, especially with the world we live in that is changing on a daily basis, then you're not really being in service of what the students need in the moment. Wouldn't you
Yeah,
say?
I think I agree, of course. I think it's a tapestry. The question is, how do we value different levels of experience within an education journey? And how do we actually resource the ability for people to upskill as they go? I think this is just as true for creative workers as it is for professors and instructors, as it is for technologists who work in education, who, as much as it is for those of us that work in administration. We do have an obligation on a macro level to be up to date on what is the current state of our fields. But I think that translates into different things for different people. So I would absolutely expect someone who is a bit of an elder statesperson in a field who is working as a professor to provide some very deep rooted education content with respect to the history, the journey of how that art field has changed over time. Because we need more than just the transactional skills transfer dynamic
Yes.
in our education programs to enable a student to be successful. There's a large value in traditional knowledge as well. We have to ensure that there are traditional skills still being put in place in our education and training programs, because if something is traditional, it largely means it has stood the test of time. And if you don't incorporate that and you're just following just the latest trends that are here in the day, then there's an equal risk of unbalancing a student's experience with respect to their education. And that's what worries me a little bit by people getting their education from YouTube videos, the latest technology trends. Like, they're great within the right context, but on their own, I don't know if that actually gives students kind of longer term skills that they need to be successful.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So if I'm understanding you, you're saying that in terms of the tapestries, then the teacher, the legacy that they bring of the 30 years, 40 years and beyond, basically, also based on what they learned from their teachers and their teachers from their teachers, is as important as part of the tapestry as it is to understand what is happening today or where the trends are going, understanding the socio-economical realities, what is the impact, understanding the business side of it, understanding all of that. So as an educational system needs to have a piece of all of that information and education accessible to the students.
Absolutely. And I think you've put it in a much more succinct way than I just did. So thank you.
Yeah, it's my job. But one thing though that I feel like I want to add, a kind of like a in brackets number 5,
Hmm.
from my perspective as a psychotherapist and as a coach, is the inner muscles, the inner reasons, the inner conversations aspect of it, and also the what it takes to actually be sustainably an artist because it takes quite a bit of work and resilience to stay in any field, but specifically in the art field because it's so personal. It uses all of us, all aspects of us, the inner, the outer, the thoughts, the feelings, the craft, all of it. And I think going back to my education, that wasn't really taught. How to stay in the game, how to stay resilient, how to do self-care, how to, when you lose access to it, when you're thrown off access as life does, you've been up all night and now you have to finish a project the next day. How do you care for yourself and still do that work? That's a piece that wasn't really taught in school, and I think it would be really relevant, especially in the world we live in, as you said, post-COVID and things just changing. So the paradigm shifts that are happening.
Yeah,
How do
and
we stay? How do we find our focus? How do we find our ground in the storm?
100%. And that's why the work that you're doing is so important. Like, I do think we need to build more of that into our education system. And that's a hot topic of conversation. It has been for a long time, but it certainly has been more since the pandemic. It makes me want to ask you, like, how do you work with your clients on this? So, what are the issues that you hear coming from the creatives that you work with, and what are some of the barriers that you think we create for ourselves in living those creative lives? How do people find success?
It is a big question, but what I see, creative professionals, but also leaders that are maybe running creative educational programs, or like yourself, or running a creative agency, or entrepreneurs running a business. It's simple and not simple. I believe a regulated nervous system does a lot better at everything than a dysregulated nervous system does at anything. So number one is to find how to find that stabilization in our system. How do I come to a place of calm so that I can have access to all of my brain, all of my competencies, instead of staying in a reactive mode that keeps me focused and also stuck in the ways that I've already have tried. A reactive system is our reactive brain only uses the neural pathways we've already formed, but a calm nervous system, the visionary side of our brain turns on. And then we can maybe come up with new solutions for whatever problem that we're dealing with. And the creative side of us really resides there, not in the reactive mode. So I say to everybody, and I can tell you 95% don't believe me, is that go get calm first, then come to me and we'll talk about it. And they think, no, because in the reactive mode, our vision is narrow on solving this problem. The reactive brain thinks, as soon as I solve this problem, I can rest. And the issue is that's just a myth, kind of like some of the myths you have. We cannot solve a problem with a new solution unless we have a calm nervous system. A lot of people say, then how do you get calm? Like when there is so much happening. And as you say, socioeconomically, people are under a lot of stress. So how can you tell me not to worry about my mortgage? Or how can you tell me not to worry about my children? And how can you tell me not to worry about whatever, my parents, this, that? I'm not saying don't worry about it. I'm saying find half an hour, one evening, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 30 seconds to find, and there are tools for all of those time frames to bring the nervous system to a place of stability. And then where you're much more likely to be able to solve that problem in a much more efficient, resourceful way. And I think resiliency really goes back to that as well. I'm a lot more resilient if I'm resourced. And resourcing actually is not that difficult. If I may just continue a little bit about, it's actually a lot easier because our limbic system, the reactive part, is a very simple system. You can actually shift it out of the reactive mode with breath. It doesn't actually need fancy solutions. It doesn't necessarily need a hot bath. It doesn't necessarily need a retreat day or a vacation. It needs maximum 2 minutes, maybe minimum 30 seconds, 3 breaths that are slow, that are calculated, And it allows your brain to go, we're not in danger. We're not, we're not being chased by a lion. And immediately your prefrontal cortex is back online. And immediately you're able to look at the problem instead of swimming in it.
I've heard so many people say that they've benefited from the kinds of techniques that you're describing, like that simple breath technique. I've also heard people say, I can't be that simple. You can't really tell me that, just by taking 30 seconds and breathing deeply that, things are going to be better. So what do you say to people who don't believe it?
I say you're absolutely right. Things are not going to get better by you breathing. You're going to have access to faculties of your brain, to capacities of your brain that you don't have right now by breathing. So if you breathe, you have access to it, and maybe you're better able to do something more creative about your problem, the issue. And I have heard that before, because, what if, my boss is laying off people. My boss is telling me make money, but it's not giving me the resources I need to make money. And I say, yeah, true. And where you are, and because we can't change our biology. So where we are in that moment, all we can look at is the problem. We can't actually think of solutions. A bit of personal, I think, history lesson for me has been, when you're living in an environment like I did, which was marked by restrictions, especially for women. If you're living in it for 20 years, you can't just wait for things to change. So what I tell usually people that say that, I say, just imagine that that's not going to change. Are you going to stay in this mode? Or are you going to take 3 to 5 deep breaths and let's think about what we can do instead of what can't be done? And so every morning I woke up growing up, it would be like, I don't know, maybe they're going to close the university. We don't know. But am I going to wait for that day to live? Am I going to wait for that day to thrive? Am I going to wait for that day to enjoy my life, to bring meaning to my life? No. And I think that just has carried over. I have a full acceptance of the limitations of my control over my environment. And yet, I also think there are things I can still do in any situation.
And you think that came because of your experiences growing up in Iran?
Partly, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And partly my stubbornness not to give up or take no for an answer. And I think it paid off, so it just stayed as a mode, as a way of showing up in life. It paid off for me. Even though I studied graphic design, it was still close enough to art. All my life, I have stayed in the periphery of art. And now looking back, I realize I actually have lived creatively. I have creatively problem solved my whole life.
Surviving and thriving is a creative act, isn't it? It always has been.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's creative, in a way, creative resistance. And I think artists right now are, if we allow the wave to scare us, then we're actually in a lot more danger than if we go, wait a minute, what can I actually creatively do about this? To make sure that I'm become relevant as an artist, to make sure that I become indisposable again, like it was in the whatever era, European era you're discussing, where art schools started, was because artists became relevant. So that's a whole other discussion, but I really do believe it.
I feel like that's the connecting tissue of these things, isn't it? That whether you're an artist or a business person or even just a human being trying to get through life, that resiliency and acknowledgement of your own creativity is the vehicle that will consistently get you through, or at least create a bridge to something that perhaps you didn't think was possible before.
Yeah. And give you access to your agency within any condition. The creativity is what gives us access to that agency. What we can do about it is our agency.
Yeah, we're never helpless in any situation, are we? Not completely.
Not completely. No, I don't think so. Or I would like to not think so. And I've proven myself for half a century that that worked. Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Um,
right on.
well, I actually want us to continue this conversation because what we didn't talk about necessarily is what are some of the topics we can actually discuss that would help creative professionals make those positive shifts, tap into their agency, become creative, think outside of the box. So I would love it if we came back together and talked about maybe specific topics and have this kind of discord again where you bring in your point of view and your expertise and how you work with students or how you see the educational system and creative field and how and what I can offer the creatives that might be listening to this or watching this.
I would love that. And that brings us right back to the Word on the Street workshop, doesn't it? In the
Yeah.
questions that we heard from that audience, and they wanted to dig deep into some of those issues. So would love to come back. Let's continue the conversation and see where
Okay.
we go.
Well, before we go, what stood out for you that day? During that workshop, at the end of that workshop, what stood out the most for you?
I would say what stood out to me the most was their hunger to understand better what options were in front of them, regardless of where they were in their creative career or life journey. It was a real struggle I felt, to understand what was the territory that existed for them to know what choices they could make, whether it was to switch from, being a photographer to being another kind of creative professional, whether or not the conditions existed for their success moving on into the future, what it meant for them to move out of a position of poverty, frankly. I think we had a few people in the room that were very honest with us about they have struggled financially and they're not living the lives that they want to. What are the tools they need in order to get there? So I think I would encapsulate it as that. There was many who felt they really needed to find a source of information to understand what was the next right move for them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. If I want to answer that question as well, and I think it's a recurring answer. It was the moment I noticed the creatives inside come back to life. I saw their eyes change. There was just a bit of a sparkle of mischief,
Mm,
the hope come back because they heard something that they could actually apply, they could actually do. So they went from that powerlessness, the reactive mode, to agency and creative mode. And I absolutely love that. I don't think I will ever get used to or get tired of seeing that moment when something goes ding in their eyes and they see a way. They see a way out of where they are. So I love that. And
absolutely.
I really thank you for inviting me to that workshop.
It was such a pleasure to have you there. And it really helped to add the dimensions to the conversation that people were craving. So let's continue it because this is an endless conversation in many ways. So I'm looking
Absolutely.
forward to the next one.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Mashad.
Bye.
Bye.